Shmai guys, welcome to the Life to the Full podcast, the podcast that helps you make the most of your time here on Earth. I'm your host, Dav Morse, and I am absolutely delighted to be back on the microphone with you once again. Now, we're in the middle of a season on physical health here on the Life to the Full podcast. We've looked at how we all think our physical health is better than $1 million. We've looked at why we should lift weights, how to breathe properly. We had that fantastic interview with Dr. Caroline Horton, where we looked at what happens when we sleep and how important sleep is. Not just for our re-energizing, but for our mental health, emotional health and physical health. But who am I kidding? I can't stick to seasons on the podcast. My monkey brain just doesn't work like that. I try my best, but sometimes I get an idea and I just have to go with that. So I had an epiphany earlier that I just needed to share with you guys. And here it is. Your emergency fund is not for emergencies. That's right. You heard me. Your emergency fund is not for emergencies. Now, first things first. If you've never heard of an emergency fund, let's just get everybody up to speed on what an emergency fund is, and then we'll get to what the best use is for an emergency fund. Now, an emergency fund in general personal finance talks are funds of money, pots of money, which you have savings set aside for maybe 3 to 6 months of living expenses. Now, of course, that doesn't actually have to be 3 to 6 months worth of your salary. Hopefully your salary is more than your living expenses. If it's not, that's another question to consider. But an emergency fund, generally speaking, 3 to 6 months of living expenses. And they are for common emergencies that might arise in people's lives. Things like boiler breaks, we need a new boiler, car repairs, or maybe you lose your job and you need to pay your mortgage or rent and bills and buy food whilst you get yourself back on your feet. Now, these are all great reasons for having an emergency fund. It's obviously much better to have an emergency fund in that situation than not having one. If you haven't got an emergency fund and something like this happens, then you're going to be ending up going into debt in order to sort them out. But I believe there is a better use for your emergency fund. Now, if you don't have 3 to 6 months worth of expenses saved up in an easy access account, which you can use whenever you need to, then I want to encourage you to get that in place. Start putting aside a little bit from your monthly budget into a separate account. Move it away from your current account where everything goes in and out of regularly, because if it's in there, you'll be tempted to spend it. Most people are anyway. Because when these events do occur, you will have something to use towards them. I think I mentioned on the podcast a while ago that these kind of emergency events, they happen with surprising regularity. I can't remember the stats off the top of my head. They were from an American audience, but the reality was there was some massive proportion of people who had faced an unexpected financial emergency in the last 12 months. I think it was upward of 50%. You'll have to go back in the podcast archives to try and find that information. If you look at any personal finance YouTuber, podcaster, they will almost all recommend having an emergency fund. If that's you, please try and put a little bit aside every month in order to start building up this buffer. Now, I understand it is tough to save right now. In fact, lots of people are dipping into any savings that they do have just to keep food on the table, just to keep the lights on, just to pay their mortgage or their rent. It's a really tough time to save right now. What with the cost of living crisis, mortgage rates going up, people coming off fixed rate mortgages, inflation is sky high. It is crazy how much more expensive things are than they were last year, 2 years ago, and people are really struggling. Lots of people are dipping into any savings that they do have. There was an article in The Guardian earlier this year saying that in May alone, £4.6 billion worth of money came out of savings accounts. Presumably, at least some of that is going towards making up for shortfalls in people's budget, making sure that they can pay for food, rent, electricity, things like that. It's not easy to start saving, to start putting things aside for the future when now is so pressing. It's not as easy as just saying, start earning more money. Although I do consider that to be a really worthwhile question to think about. What can I do to earn more money? Despite how difficult it is definitely a worthy financial goal to be aiming towards, to have 3 to 6 or even 12 months worth of expenses set aside in an emergency fund so that you can service any of these problems that more than likely will arise. In a past episode, I mentioned how important it is to have an emergency fund set up because there's a massive proportion of people that face financial difficulties, financial emergencies, things that are unexpected that come up every month. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was north of 50% of people every year face some kind of financial expense that they weren't expecting to face. So having that emergency fund is really important. But that's not the most important thing about an emergency fund. So what is the real purpose of an emergency fund? The real purpose of an emergency fund is to give yourself options. An emergency fund is for giving yourself options. I recently put together an audio course called Quit Teaching, Start Living. I'm not here to heavily promote it. It is designed to help disillusioned teachers who feel trapped in their job to make a quit teaching plan so they can get their lives back again. Lots of the lessons are applicable to other walks of life. I'll leave a link in the show notes if anyone does want to check that out. But one of the massive takeaways in the course is how having an emergency fund means you can quit if you want to. You have the option to quit. You have the option to change your situation. It stops you from being stuck. I hear daily from people, teachers mainly, who say, I'm stuck in this awful environment and I can't leave because I have a mortgage to pay, kids to feed, etc., etc. There are hundreds, probably thousands of teachers and other workers who are facing appalling conditions at work. They're being told they have to come in on their days off for meetings. They're being bullied and driven off sick by horrendous management. They're saying that their mental health is suffering. Relationships are ending because of the demands of their jobs. They are missing out on their own kids growing up. Some are being assaulted at work and getting no support, working themselves almost to death, and yet they say, I can't leave. My heart goes out to anyone in that situation who feels like they are stuck because they have no options. This is what an emergency fund is really for. To empower you to make choices that would otherwise be too scary to make. The reason these people feel they have no choice but to carry on in a broken system is that they have to make rent next month. They dread the feeling of rent's due and having no money to pay for it. Yes, an emergency fund helps in situations where you need to buy a new car or the render on your loft extension starts crumbling. But surely, having the option to say, I can leave this situation because I know I can live for a few months with no income until I can find a different option, is priceless. The ability to say, actually, I don't need to put up with this bad situation just so that I can have some money next month, is a phenomenally amazing thing. The same can be true for other situations. It may be you want to move closer to a family member who's sick, to care for them or be with them, or you want to move closer to someone to develop a relationship with them. An emergency fund means you can make changes in your life that you'd be otherwise unable to make. That is the beauty of an emergency fund. Of course, the best time to give yourself options is before you need them. Having this in place before you are stuck in that situation that you want out of is so important. If you find yourself stuck and you haven't got that emergency fund, it's going to be so much harder to get the emotional capacity to leave, even though that sometimes might be the best thing, even if you haven't got an emergency fund. But to have that emergency fund in place makes that decision so much easier. This is true, of course, for most areas in life. The best time to have insurance is before you need it. The best time to get an emergency glass breaker is before your car is tumbled off a bridge and you're sinking into the lake. The best time to get toilet paper is before all the shops have run out of toilet paper. Throwback to 2020 there. Don't wait until you're stuck before you make the decision to start building an emergency fund. There does get a point where you've built up your emergency fund and other investments, and the size of your investment portfolio negates the need for an emergency fund. You don't need one. But that's a chat for another day. That's it for today, folks. I do hope this episode finds you in a good place, one that you can stay in to start building up your freedom fund. That's a new name for your emergency fund. Start to build it up now to give yourself the options before you need them. If you find yourself stuck, let this be your sign that you need to start making building an emergency fund a priority. Then you can start planning your next move. Please, if you know someone who needs to hear this message, share this episode with them. My job is to serve you all, and I absolutely love it. I'd love to get the message out there to more people. You can get in touch on Instagram. I am David Morse and Life to the Full podcast. You can follow and subscribe wherever you are listening to this. Until next time, peace out.